Right, gonna get started because it is 12:30 and we've only got an hour. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope firstly that you and your loved ones are staying safe and well. My name is Katie Jacobs and I look after HR Leader Activity and Proposition at the CIPD. I'm pleased to be able to continue hosting the CIPD's series of coronavirus webinars today with another session on furlough. Could we just get the next slide, please, and I'll introduce our speakers. So joining me today, we've got David D'Souza, Membership Director of the CIPD, Andrew Willis, Head of Legal and Advisory at HR Inform, which is the CIPD's employment law resource, and Tom Blake, Managing Director and Executive Coach at Blake Connolly Limited. Our webinar last week on this topic was oversubscribed, but it is now available on demand. If you haven't seen it, I would really encourage you to go and watch it. It contains a lot of useful advice and a practical case study from an HR director about how they implemented furlough for, I think, 94% of their organisation. We know how hard the people profession is working to keep organisations going and employees supported during this crisis. And I would once again like to say thank you for everything that you're doing. We hope that the content and the community that the CIPD is providing is helping. First up, just some quick housekeeping. Please be aware that this session is going to be recorded. It will be available on demand via the webinar section of the CIPD website sometime this afternoon. Please do share it with your peers and colleagues. We've had a lot of questions submitted in advance. If you want to ask additional questions during the webinar, please could you use the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen, and could you use that rather than the chat box for questions? We're not going to be monitoring the chat box and it's a little bit distracting for speakers to have it popping up the whole time. Attendees are going to be muted the whole time because we've got 898 people watching this right now, so you're going to need to type your questions rather than attempt to say them verbally. We won't be able to answer all your questions in the time that we have. If you have questions that aren't answered, CIPD members can call our HR Inform helpline. It's available 24/7 and you will get an individual response. And we're updating the FAQs on our website all the time as new information becomes available. Head to the CIPD Coronavirus Hub for more. And I've just been told just before we came on this that the HR Inform furlough letter and policy template are going to be up on the Coronavirus Hub. If they're not up there already, they'll be up there later today, so you'll be able to download and use those. We're aiming to put out 2 webinars a week from now on, so please do look out for these as subjects are being announced all the time. So today we're going to be talking again about the ins and outs of the government's coronavirus job retention scheme, which allows UK employers with employees on PAYE schemes to designate those employees as furloughed workers. Now, as we know from our various communities, there still exists quite a lot of confusion over some of the practicalities of the furlough scheme. We're going to do our best to dispel some of that confusion over the next hour. Where we don't have the information yet, we'll make that clear. The bulk of this session is going to be spent answering your questions, but first I'd like to invite David to give a quick welcome and set some context.
Hello everyone. Katie has made me promise that I will give a quick welcome, so welcome. Just to be as brief as I can, there's a couple of asks that I would make of you. One is, this is a really difficult area. So whilst you're dealing with it, and we've got 2 experts, it's always worth, and we were talking about this just before we came on actually, take into account that this is entirely new for everyone. So there's new information coming out each day. It's becoming clearer, I think, as to how things could or should be done or what the expectation is, but we're still feeling through it together. So listen to the advice that's given here today and take that on board. But the second thing that I'd ask people to do is just be kind to each other as well and be kind to organisations. So I've seen quite a bit of noise recently about people's consternation with other organisations and the approach that they're taking. And all I would say is we're each dealing with an individual context. So there may be organisations where it's possible to top up because the cash flow allows it. There may be organisations that are welcoming people back into the organisation for the purposes of furloughing them. But please, please make sure that you're solving in the right way for what you're doing in your business and the context that you have there, doing it in the right way with the right principles, and spend as much time as you can focusing on that. and maybe less time on some of the other areas that the media is drawing attention to, because we all know that at this point we're all facing the same challenges. How do you make difficult calls in a difficult situation with limited information? So hopefully today's call will help with some of the technical kind of questions. There's over 1,000 participants, as Katie says. Won't get to all of the questions, particularly if you ask one each, but I will take as much of a back seat as I can as possible and leave it to two of the latest experts that we have.
Thank you, David. That was suitably brief. Before we get on to the questions, Andrew is going to give a quick overview of the updated guidance on furlough that was released last week on the 3rd of April. So Andrew, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Katie. So to begin with, we're going to look at the latest updates to the job retention scheme, which were published over last weekend. And the first of these was around the money that can be reclaimed under the scheme. So that's on our next slide, I think. Thank you. So it's been confirmed that money that can be claimed includes past overtime, fees, although what exactly fees are in the context of employment isn't clear, and also compulsory commission payments. Now, again, compulsory isn't defined because the contrast here is between compulsory commission payments and discretionary payments. You would think that word compulsory really means contractual. So if you owe employees compulsory, i.e. contractual commission, then that is payable under the scheme and you can claim reimbursement for it. Any discretionary bonuses, however, cannot be reclaimed. And they appear in that list of claimants that cannot be claimed, along with non-cash payments, perhaps like private health cover and other discretionary bonuses like tips. So a little bit more clarification there on what can be claimed. It's not only basic wages and salary, it also includes overtime, it also includes fees and probably contractual commission payments as well. In terms of who can receive payments, and this is the next slide, it's been clarified that office holders can receive reimbursement under this scheme by their employers, and this includes directors and salaried members of limited liability partnerships. It's clear though, as with everybody else under the furlough scheme, these people cannot be undertaking work while furloughed. However, they may still carry out their statutory duties, and for a company director, basically statutory duties involve protecting the well-being of the company. So briefly, they must act within their powers, promote the success of the company, exercise reasonable care, skill and diligence, and avoid conflicts of interest. What they mustn't do though is do anything to generate commercial revenue for the business or to provide services for and on behalf of the business. And that will apply to salaried members of partnerships as well. So limited to their duties as partners or directors only. Next slide. In addition to directors and members of LLPs, it's also been clarified that apprentices qualify for reimbursement under this scheme as well. Although people providing an apprenticeship are encouraged to think about, along with the training provider and the apprentice themselves, whether a learning break is more appropriate in these circumstances. As with all employees on furlough, apprentices can carry on with training while they are furloughed, but this is training only. It must not involve anything, again, which generates revenue or which provides services. Subject to that, then you can reclaim 80% of anything paid during that period. Of course, particularly applicable in the case of apprentices, but also any employee, they must be paid in full if they're attending training. If that keeps them above national minimum wage rate, you mustn't go below national minimum wage rate. You can only claim back 80% in any event, but if you need to pay 100% to pay national minimum wage, then you must do that for at least the period of the training. You do not have to do it for any period during which the employee or apprentice isn't working and isn't training. But if they're training, you must pay at least national minimum wage. The next slide covers second jobs and also employees who are shielding. So it's been clarified that employees with more than one employer can be furloughed for each job, for one or the other, or for neither of them. Each job's treated separately for these purposes, and the cap of 2,500, 80% applies to each employer individually as well. Now, your contracts may well have clauses covering second employment, whether or not employers can take second jobs, the circumstances in which they might do that, and what you would need them to do to protect your business. And they would continue to apply in this situation. So you do not have to go outside of those provisions and allow second employment beyond them. There's no compulsion on you to do that at all. Although obviously in the circumstances that we're in, some of you may choose to do that and be a little bit more flexible than you might otherwise be. The other group covered on this slide are shielding employees. And it's been clarified that employers can claim reimbursement for furloughed employees who are shielding in line with public health guidance, whether that's for their own health reasons or whether they need to stay at home with somebody else who is shielding. Provided, number one, they're unable to work from home, and number two, if the employer would otherwise have to make them redundant. So again, broadly in line with the wider nature of the scheme, but just clarification that people shielding can be furloughed. And then the last area we'll look at that was updated last week concerns the rehiring of employees, and that's on the final slide on the update. So the guidance that was updated last weekend clarified that anybody who left their employer for any reason after 28th of February can be rehired by their old employer and be taken back and included in the furlough scheme. Very importantly, there's absolutely no obligation on you to do that for anybody who's left you. So you'll need to think about what to do based on the needs of your organisation first and foremost. There's absolutely no obligation on you to take people back. And this whole idea of rehiring staff raises a number of questions. The first, from an employment law point of view, would be whether you are reinstating somebody to their old employment or whether you're re-engaging them on new terms. Almost certainly, if you took somebody back, you will be looking to agree terms with them. Not least, you'd probably be looking to agree that they will only receive 80% of their former salary. So in securing that agreement, you're effectively starting them on new terms, and that becomes a re-engagement situation rather than one of reinstatement to the former job. But that still presents a risk to organisations, because even if you are re-engaging, if there isn't a clear week between one contract ending and the new one beginning, then that person will come back with continuity preserved. And of course, assuming they have sufficient continuity, that gives the right to claim unfair dismissal, to claim redundancy pay if they're eventually made redundant at the end of the furlough period. So we've had no further guidance on whether that is the case, what the implications might be, whether exceptions might be made here. So I think the message would be on rehires: proceed with caution, because it does come with risks to the organisation as well. So that's an update on the 5 or 6 changes that were, or updates that were included in the updated guidance last week. I'm sure some of these subjects will arise now in the context of the questions we'll see.
Thank you very much for that, Andrew. So actually I'll start with the last point, because we've had quite a few questions on staff that had already been either made redundant or had chosen to leave an organisation to go somewhere else and then had their offer rescinded, and a few asking what the risks are when it comes to re-employing people to put them on furlough, and then if you are able to make them redundant, you have to unfurlough them to then make them redundant. I don't know, Tom, if you want to give some kind of thoughts on that, because I know you've been like really tuned into what HMR.
And thanks, Katie. And first of all, thanks a lot for having me on the webinar. For those who don't know me, I'm an HR consultant. I'm an independent HR consultant running my own business. It's an interesting area because, absolutely, as Andrew says, we don't know what the employment implications will be of re-engaging someone, whether or not they have continuity of employment and those preservations there. We're hoping that we're going to get some updates from HMRC or the government at some point soon to actually really set out what the position is, which that's why Andrew's absolutely right in saying treat it with caution. The redundancy question is probably a slightly separate one. I would look at it as in terms of the question being, can you complete a redundancy consultation while somebody is on furlough and then make them redundant at the end of the furlough period? And yes, you can. Within the guidance, it specifically says that at the end of the furlough period, your employer might not have a role for you, so you would have to go through a redundancy process, which takes us into actually you can complete your redundancy process while individuals are on furlough. You don't have to bring them back to be able to do that.
Thank you. Got quite a lot of questions on pay, some of which are quite specific. We've had a lot around bank holidays falling within the furlough period and whether we need to be paying people in full for those bank holidays. I don't know if Andrew, Tom, got any thoughts on that, because I think it's still a little bit unclear on annual leave.
Happy to go first. It's been a moving feast. It's gone backwards and forwards, and even ACAS have done a 180 on their guidance. They published latest guidance on the 7th of April, which has come effectively off the back of the tweet from HMRC that says that while you are on furlough, individuals can get their bank holiday and they can take annual leave, and it is for the employer to pay at 100%. So there is clarity there from a tweet. Whether or not we can take a tweet as this is an official governmental answer, I think people are going to, because in the absence of formal guidance, that's what you're going to have to go with. And I believe that's why ACAS, as I said, have kind of reversed their view. Originally, they were saying it was incompatible, furlough and annual leave, but now they're saying it is, and the employer pays the top up.
Yeah, I think the original confusion arose there because it was made clear from the outset that you couldn't be claiming SSP or SMP whilst on furlough, and people assumed from that meant that any kind of leave was incompatible with being on furlough. But in actual fact, the issue there was the government trying to avoid paying out twice, trying to avoid paying out SSP, SMP and 80% as well. So I think it's becoming clearer that actually periods of leave are not necessarily incompatible with a period of furlough. But as you say, Tom, you'd have to pay that at 100% to honour the contract.
Yeah.
And working time regulations, obligations as well.
And can you be encouraging people to take annual leave during being furloughed?
I think there's nothing wrong with encouraging people to do that. If they're happy to do that, obviously the payoff for them is that they get 100% of their pay. And your contract may allow you to request that employees take annual leave, and according to the working time regs, there's a notice provision as well that allows you to do that as well. So I think certainly it's possible, but a careful reading of the contract is advisable before you proceed down that route.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, we've got contractual provisions. If they're in place, you can, as the employer, you can do it. Obviously, from the engagement perspective, what you probably want to look at is selling the benefits of doing that, because if people are on lockdown, they're not leaving their homes anyway. Are they really going to be taking annual leave as a benefit right now? But again, if you then balance it with a business's need for cash flow, do they really want all of their employees coming back with a bulk of annual leave to take? So I think, to David's earlier point, it's going to come down to your individual circumstances in your company and how you work with your individuals. I think the key point is that you can enforce it under contractual and working time regulation provisions. Should you, is organisational context.
Mm-hmm. And we've had a question about whether compassionate leave should be treated the same as holiday, if that's contractual rights. So should that be increased to 100% as well?
I'm going to defer to Andrew because I saw that this morning and went, oh, that's an interesting one. Let's see what the lawyer has to say first.
Well, I mean, for the reasons we've already discussed, I don't think there's anything incompatible with taking any period of leave and being furloughed as well. And I think in the case of this particular leave, compassionate leave allowed under the contract, this is something that can be negotiated with your employee if you need to. You may well be negotiating a general wage reduction with them anyway, and bringing them down to 80%. So in doing that, you could also incorporate any contractual entitlements like this as well and seeking to vary those. Or you could choose to pay 100% if you're bound by the contract to do it, or if you otherwise want to. Obviously, you've got to bear in mind you can only claim back 80% in that situation. But I think because it's a contractual benefit, provided you can agree something with your employee, it's open to negotiation.
And I guess my advice on that from a slightly different to legal perspective would be, given the situation we're currently in, given the amount of people that are suffering bereavement in particular at the moment, thinking about that proactively and communicating that proactively would actually be a compassionate thing to do. Obviously, communicate your decision on it in a very careful way, but actually you don't want to be in a situation where someone's lost someone that's dear to them and you're attempting to negotiate whether you're paying them 80% pay or 100% pay. So having an organisational policy on that rather than case by case and doing that proactively will, for some people in very bad situations, help alleviate their concerns or their uncertainty at a very stressful time.
Thank you. We've had a few questions asking about what happens if people were employed before the 28th of February, but maybe only a couple of days before, but they weren't on PAYE payroll until March. Are they eligible, or is it about being physically on the payroll as opposed to being actually employed?
So I specifically, I've asked HMRC that specific question, and they have said that that should be fine, purely and simply because ultimately missing out on that, being employed but missing out on physically being on payroll is an administrative issue rather than anything else. And ultimately it comes down to payroll cut-offs. You know, some organisations for February pay, their payroll cut-off, it might be very early February because they are a mid-month payer. So they have confirmed that as long as they are employed and there is a payroll record, it's going to be in March, but we can see that it was employment before the 28th, they are saying that that should be fine.
The other related question there concerns people recruited before the 28th of February, but actually who do not start work until after the 1st of March, or after the 1st of March. And the original wording of the guidance was fairly ambiguous, and it talked about hires pre-28th February, while at the same time saying that people needed to be on the payroll on the 28th of February. And I think some took that to mean that as long as you've made an offer to somebody before the end of March, it didn't matter that they didn't actually start with you until 1st of March or afterwards, you could claim for them. I don't think that's the case. I think you at least have to be employed, as Thomas said there, on the 28th of February to qualify for this scheme. Yeah,
and to add to that, the Parliamentary Select Committee on coronavirus that was held yesterday confirmed that this date of the 28th of February is actually its first line in defence against fraud. So they've got 4 lines of defence. So although there is a campaign, New Starter Furlough campaign, to try and get new starters included, it's looking doubtful that HMRC are going to change that. So this date of the 28th is very, very important. I think the point is, if you were employed in February but you just were placed onto payroll administratively after, then you will be included from what HMRC is saying. But if you are employed after the 28th of February, you're not included.
Thank you. Can you share any light on advice around selection criteria that you should be using for furloughing? Somebody's raised the fact that what if you've got a number of staff performing the same role, but you only need 25% of them to be furloughed and you want to keep 75%, but it's quite hard to tell who should be furloughed.
Yeah, I think the way I would look at this, obviously furlough being a brand new world, is what would you do under a redundancy process? So having a fair, transparent process. The other thing you could look at is whether or not if you've got the ability to rotate your workforce around. So for example, could you have a proportion of your workforce on furlough for 3 weeks? You then bring them back while cohort number 2 go on furlough for 3 weeks. So rotating furlough has been confirmed as being allowed. But in terms of selection criteria, make it objective, non-discriminatory, elements that need to come into it as well. So if it's performance, again, it's going to depend on your organisational, what you generally would do under a redundancy process, so that it's looked at as fair and transparent, so that you can defend it and you can really easily tell your employees, this is how we've made these decisions.
I agree there, and I think as teams get smaller, you probably need more people who are multi-skilled, so you need to find an objective way in your organisation of measuring that and selecting those people who can perhaps cover more than one role if they need to. The odd situation we're in here is that normally in redundancy, people are looking to avoid being made redundant. In some organisations, I think at the moment, people are looking for reasons as to why they aren't being furloughed.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of an odd situation, but absolutely agree that there is potential here for discrimination claims at least. And so you need to be finding objective ways of selecting people.
Yeah, I think the redundancy kind of principle is probably the best way of doing it. But as you point out, voluntary furloughing is a relatively new concept. But I know that certainly some organisations are facing into the reality of one, having some people, wishing that they were able to not be working, either for lifestyle choices or for genuine need. And that's, again, different communication. But as Tom says, as long as you can be transparent and consistent and justify it, then I think that's as safe and as good as you can be in terms of making that judgment.
To pick up on that point about people wanting to be furloughed, what is the obligation of an employer if people are requesting it because of either, what you put it, lifestyle choices, or probably more likely caring responsibilities, but you wouldn't be making them redundant and there is still work for them to do? What obligation is there?
So looking at the guidance, there is actually no obligation on the employer to make somebody furlough. It is an agreement between the employer and the employee. So it's actually it's a two-party thing. We take the care and responsibilities out of it for 1 second, because that's a bit of a grey area that I think has become even greyer over the last week. But in general circumstances, if you've got employees coming to you going, I want to be furloughed, well, if you have work for them to do, you're not going to be able to claim the grant anyway. And this is about your ability as an organisation to claim the grant back from the government. So, but it is an agreement. It's an agreement between the employer and the employee. On the caring responsibilities, I think the update that Andrew gave on the guidance, I think it's actually clouded the issue a little bit, looking at caring and shielding. So the question is, can anybody who has got childcare responsibilities, regardless of what is going on in the business, can they ask to be furloughed and then be successful? Question mark, because the overriding principle of furlough is your business has been impacted significantly by coronavirus. So there's a question mark personally for me there. And the second one with shielding, because again, I'm sure we'll have questions on shielding that we can come to, it's got greyer because of this requirement to otherwise have made people redundant. But I think if we've got more questions on shielding, Katie, I'll probably leave it there for now.
Andrew, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I mean, I think that summarises it. I mean, ultimately, though, it's a decision for the employer as to whether it's in a situation where it can and should furlough. And then obviously you're looking to agree with employers as far as possible from there. But first and foremost, it's a decision for the employer.
Yeah, I think the purpose of the scheme has been very clear in terms of what the government's attempting to do. And it somewhat violates that notion when people would just like paid time off. That's not what it's there for. It's there to make sure that actually businesses are avoiding making redundancies where they don't have to, and where the organisation may be able to pick up in terms of volume of work in the future. So there's certainly, I think, no ethical obligation on an organisation to furlough someone just because they've asked. But to the point that Tom made, that obviously varies slightly in the way that you'd look at it. If the reason they're asking isn't that they just don't want to come into work, but actually there's a family situation or a shielding situation that sits in the background.
Okay. Got some questions about training while you're on furlough that fall into the two categories, I think. Firstly, can you just confirm about payment and topping up? And secondly, how much training is reasonable to expect somebody to do? And would you be on shaky ground potentially if you're expecting somebody to do too much?
So payments, you don't pay somebody while they are training. The only expectation, well, it's not an expectation, the only requirement is you have to ensure that anybody who is below national minimum wage is topped up to national minimum wage for the hours that they are training. And that's a top up, so you're not going to be able to claim it from the government. On that point though, just as a slight aside, HMRC did make it quite clear yesterday on the select committee that they are expecting employers, I think it's a soft expectation, that employers will automatically top people up to national minimum wage anyway, without the training aspect. So they kind of have made this slightly soft, well, we think you should. So that's probably just something to bear in mind. But if you have employees on training, they have to be paid at least national minimum wage. Slightly different for apprentices because it has to be at least the apprentice minimum wage, national minimum wage, or national living wage. One of those three, whatever one of those three that they are guided under. In terms of volume of training, there's nothing in the guidance to say that you could have them on training every single day. Again, on the select committee, they were quite clear. They kind of want people to be doing training as long as that training does not either provide a service or it doesn't attract revenue, then it's fine. And that's now or in the future. So you couldn't be voluntarily training to do product design and development for a product that's going to go out in a year's time, for example. But yesterday very much they were advocating for training and to make sure that people are keeping engaged, because it's a good way actually to keep your individuals engaged with you as an organisation as well. So yeah, I think it's now actually quite clear about what you can and can't do under training.
I'm just going to ask a couple of things that come in while you're speaking, just to get some clarity. So one, Annette's asking if we are already paying people, topping them up to 100%, do we still have to pay them for training time?
Well, you're already doing it anyway, so you're already surpassing the requirement. So what you're doing kind of trumps the minimum requirement that I just talked about.
Mm-hmm. And Hayley, do all employees have to be paid full pay whilst on training, or still the 80% only if they earn more than the national minimum wage?
No, so it's not full pay. So you're not paying them for training. All you're doing is ensuring those who are on low wages receive an absolute minimum of national minimum wage. That's the only requirement.
Always important to remember as well that to pay 80%, you do need employees' agreement, whether that be for a period of non-working or for a period of training. You need their agreement to pay less than their usual rate. But as Tom said, that the absolute minimum is you must pay them national minimum wage, even if that means paying them 100% for time on training, you must pay that.
Yeah, I've just had somebody collate some questions on shielding and send them to me, so I'm triple screening. So people are asking, there's still a lack of clarity on whether shielding employees can be furloughed, even if their role is not otherwise at risk. So does their role have to be at risk if they're shielding, but we wouldn't otherwise make them redundant? How does that work? So I think what you were saying, Tom, just a little bit of confusion, if you could offer some thoughts to the tax office.
Yeah, so my personal view, it'd be interesting, Andrew, to hear your view on it as well. I think the latest guidance actually confused the situation. I thought it was clearer beforehand because of this addition of otherwise make the individual redundant. Well, if you would otherwise make the individual redundant because of coronavirus, you can automatically put them on furlough anyway. So I don't quite understand why it's been linked to shielding. And a personal thought, I do wonder if this guidance is going to be updated again and to almost remove that requirement, because the way that I was thinking about it before was that if you are shielding, even if there is work available in your workplace, so let's not worry about work at home, because if you can work from home, you still do your job. You're not going to be, and you're not sick. You can still do your job from home. You don't need to be furloughed, and shielding still applies. If you're shielding at home and your job is on site, you can't get there because of public health guidelines. You can't get there because the government is saying, don't go to work. So that, I thought, was quite a clear requirement to say, actually, companies, you can shield these people, because we're telling you that they can't come into work. So it's not their fault that they can't fulfill their working obligations. So that, I thought that was quite clear. I know there was confusion, but personally I was quite clear on it. This update, I think, makes it more opaque. I think they've gone back to the realm of, you have to have this clear link to otherwise made redundant. So I'm not quite sure where it sits, but Andrew, really keen for your view.
Yeah.
I haven't spoken to a lawyer yet about it.
Well, I mean, I agree with you that it's confused, because in some parts of the guidance, it talks about the furlough scheme only really applying where the other option would be redundancy. But then it talks more widely about the opportunity to furlough, maybe in wider circumstances. I mean, just looking at the introductory text to the guidance, I mean, there's a line in there: all employers are eligible for claim under the scheme, and the government recognises that different businesses will face different impacts from coronavirus. So that, in a sense, sets a wider context for the whole thing. So I think we still need more clarity, really, on whether it has to be a situation of redundancy or else, or whether actually this is applicable in wider circumstances, and we're still waiting for that.
When do you think we might get that? And sorry, I know you don't have a crystal ball. That's quite unfair.
Well, so the only bit to say is that on the committee yesterday, they did say that they are working on another set of updates. But it did sound as though it was going to be more technical guidance around actually how employers would go and claim the claim via the portal. But I would probably expect any further updates to the scheme to be released at the same time. So probably for us lovely HR people, that's another weekend's worth of work, because every time it comes out, it's at the weekend for us, which is lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you, Tom?
It's hobby now, isn't it? I think. And they are, I mean, we talked about this earlier, they are exceptional circumstances, and that includes for the teams in government that are having to draft this. I think what is clear is that initially it was drafted as if you were going to make people redundant, please do this instead scheme. And now, since people have fed in that actually there are other people that aren't caught in that safety net, there's been an extension of it. And to what extent those two things are compatible is cloudier probably in some of the later releases. But you can see actually the responsiveness of the government to the challenge through some of those changes.
Thank you. Got some questions around if you've got a short-term work or layoff clauses in your contract, do you still need employees' written agreement to be placed on furlough? And I did see this is a separate question, but also about consent. Do you need consent if you're topping up to 100%?
I think you need agreement. I think you need agreement to furlough in all circumstances, and I think you need separate agreement to a wage reduction if that's what you're looking to impose. Obviously, if you have a valid layoff or short-time working clause in your contracts that you can rely on, then layoff or short-time working is an option for you as well. But in these circumstances, the overwhelming majority of employers will choose to take advantage of the furlough scheme because it's paid for and it keeps employees more engaged during this crisis. So it's the obvious way to go for everybody if it works for the business and if it's applicable in the circumstances.
I think just to add to that, I think within the guidance, again, I think there was a bit more clarity that came out on the latest update that says it does need to be confirmed in writing. So whatever it is you are doing, and the employer must retain that record for 5 years. So that just gives a scale, I think, of how long HMRC are going to give themselves to try and audit companies. So I'm not generally the biggest advocate of admin in HR. I'm more of the get rid of as much admin as you possibly can. This is an example where I think your admin and your documentation is going to help you. So anytime you are making an agreement with the employee, make sure it is formally documented and that you are then retaining that record for 5 years.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to come to some questions on maternity leave. So a pregnant staff member is on furlough and is receiving 80% of pay. Will this affect statutory maternity payment? Can you clarify how those on maternity leave should be processed?
Well, I think maternity leave and furlough are not incompatible, but you would treat maternity leave in the way that you always have. I can't add any more than that, really. It's just treated in the usual way. Obviously, any enhancements that you owe will be paid as normal as well, but you can reclaim those. But you cannot reclaim for anything that's paid under statute, SMP.
And can we furlough an employee who's due to return to work from maternity leave in April?
Yes, I don't see any issue with that at all. When their maternity leave ends, you bring them back, and they can be immediately furloughed if that's the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, Kate, just on that point, HMRC have also clarified what the relevant salary is for a maternity returner coming back, because obviously if somebody's taken a year off and they are effectively on zero pay on the 28th of February, to have them furloughed, you would automatically assume that, well, they're furloughed on zero pay. HMRC have confirmed that actually that's not the case. You would use their regular pay. So you would go back to their full-time pay to furlough them on that, because otherwise they're going to clearly be at a disadvantage.
And what if somebody's asked this, what if the person coming back was about to switch to part-time hours?
So I've had this question a few times. I would furlough and then do the switch of to part-time hours after the end of the furlough period, because effectively furlough is a pause, it's a work interruption. Mm-hmm. So the part-time hours would be coming back to undertake work. So personally, the advice I've been given is furlough the person based on their current terms and conditions, and then once the end of the furlough period comes to an end, re-engage them on the new part-time ways of working. It also feels a fairer way to do it for the individual.
And again, we're back to that situation of a contractual variation. If it's agreed by both sides, I agree that's the way to go.
Don't know how common this will be, but somebody's got a staff member stuck abroad and they be furloughed. Not sure if they're able to work.
Well, it's an interesting one, because again, it's actually quite common. I've had this question quite a few times personally. The requirement under furlough is to be quote unquote available for work. So effectively, as the employee, you can call the individual back as and when. And the question becomes, well, how feasible is it for that person to come back to work? Now, you could look at it two ways. If they can perform their role quote unquote at home, and it just so happens they're at home in a different country, well, they can still do their job, so you probably could furlough them. If their job is on site and they've got no way of actually getting back, and you know that as the employer, I think you're probably more on shaky ground to go, well, I know that individual can't be available for work. Mm-hmm. But again, I think it might be an area that needs a little bit of clarification.
Anything to add there, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I guess another question might be, why are they abroad? Have they been abroad working? Are they normally based abroad, at least for part of their time? That will be more compatible with furloughing, I think, than if they've been stranded abroad on holiday.
Well, can you unfurlough an employee to go off on maternity? So kind of the other way around.
Yeah.
Yes, I would say that you can, but not necessarily any need to, because the two aren't incompatible.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, just to return to the previous questions, I think I might have asked it wrong. Will statutory maternity pay be calculated based on reduced pay, so the 80%, or normal pay?
I'd have to defer to a payroll expert on that. Tom, don't know whether you...
Yeah, this is where I do think the question, although maternity and furlough are not incompatible, so you can do one or the other, you're then starting to get into the pay realm. I would just for argument's sake, a logical way to think about it is I'd probably take the person off of furlough, quote unquote, to get them back up to 100 pay, and then you do your maternity based on the 100%. Otherwise, you might be in this really weird grey world of going, well, your maternity is now based on a proportion of your salary because of another reason. So I would probably just take the step to go, actually, I'm going to unfurlough you, but then on the same day, I'm going to put you on maternity leave so that I can make sure your pay is calculated based off of your regular pay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any advice on cash flow? So if you're having to pay 80% of wages, but then wait to be able to get the top, claim it back from the government, is there any way we can manage cash flow better so that, yeah, because obviously you're going to have to wait for the money. So I guess that's less of a legal advice, but more of a kind of business commercial question.
So I think there's a couple of things on this. So yesterday, in the update with the Parliamentary Committee, HMRC confirmed that employers will be able to apply for their grants 14 days before their payroll is run. So you can do it 2 weeks ahead of time. Now, obviously, that doesn't necessarily help people right now because the portal is not open. They've said that their target date to get the portal open is the 20th of April, with first payments being made by the 30th of April. So once we're over this initial lump of claims that are going to go through, you can actually start submitting based on doing it 2 weeks prior to your payroll. In terms of trying to get you from now to then, the advice I've been giving to clients, you've got business interruption loans that have been set up. HMRC have been quite strong with the banks to try and make sure the banks are actually getting money to employers quickly. And the only other thing aside from that, if you don't qualify for the business interruption loans, is to talk to your banks and your financial lenders to see what can happen. Now, the only other thing that you could possibly do, and it would be to seek an agreement with your employees, is to get them to agree that they will hold on, they will wait for their salary to be paid until you've actually got the grant from the government. And I'm sure I've seen somewhere from HMRC that they think that is allowed. Whether it's allowed under contractual law or employment law is probably a different question that I'll turn over to Andrew on.
Yeah, and again, it's a question of having to agree that, but you would think if the alternative is the business going under, that the employees in this situation will be ready to agree that, given the extreme circumstances we face. But yeah, absolutely, you would need agreement from employers to implement that change.
So I think the key thing for employers in this caught in this way is to have a really open and honest conversation with your workforces. Normally businesses don't like to necessarily do that because they want to shield them from the impacts of what a business is actually going through, but especially on the economic side. But if you're actually sitting down having a genuine conversation going, look, we have no money to pay you until this money comes through. And as Andrew says, well, what's the alternative? Well, redundancy effectively is the alternative, but the employer still won't even have the money to pay the redundancy. So there are things available to help with cash flow, but I think the biggest thing is actually having a very open and honest conversation with your employees so they understand the position that you are all in as a business. It's not just down to the business leader. A business is made up of people, and everybody should be aware of what is going on in the business, particularly right now.
And that's, again, I'll come back to the sympathy with the profession at the moment piece. So we saw a very high profile employer try and be transparent yesterday with their staff and say, look, these are the consequences. This is how it's laid out. And that can come across as a lack of compassion, or that can come across as quite cold. I actually think keeping people informed is key. And so if you do see, someone lifting the odd line of text from a letter and putting it out in the media, I think that's really disingenuous and really unfair at the moment. Being clear with people isn't the same as not caring.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that.
And have HMRC confirmed when they'll pay the grant and how long we need to wait before it's paid?
So what they have said so far, so if we think about the first tranche, the target date is portal open on the 20th of April, with first payments being made by the 30th of April. What they are trying to achieve is a 4 to 6 business day turnaround from claim to money going into businesses' bank accounts. And don't forget, it has to be a UK bank account, can't be an overseas bank account. And the reason why they're putting in a 4 to 6 days is because that's part of their fraud checks as well, to ensure that these payments are legitimate. It might feel like a long time, 6 working days to kind of get the money through, but they do have to put in some checks and balances for fraud.
A couple of questions about public sector or organisations that receive government funding. So I understand that the government did not expect public sector organisations to furlough employees as they're funded by the government. Is there any advice you can provide around furloughing in the public sector and the options available in such circumstances when working from home isn't feasible?
So I think the public sector, the government haven't said that you can't, which I think is an important thing. They haven't said you can't, if you are a public sector organisation, you cannot furlough. That's not there. They've actually opened the door, because under the section of who can claim, it does say public sector in there. And there is kind of light wording around under the public sector guidance that it is possible. Now, I think one of the reasons, if you look at the reasons why the government are probably saying what they're saying, is at this point in time, we as a society are using our public services probably more so. So they're effectively going, well, you're probably not going to really need to do it because your public service usage is going to go up. People need you more, so you shouldn't have that many reasons. So you start to narrow down organisations that are public sector where service is starting to get reduced. Now, if you're following the same thought process, you probably still could furlough based on a reduction of service. And if the outcome is going to be redundancy because of coronavirus, you probably can furlough them. They haven't said you can't. The other element, which then kind of does cloud it, is these two elements of caring responsibilities and shielding. Whether or not they then become incompatible because you are public sector. Now, at the end of the day, I'm sure the government don't want every single working parent in the public sector to now say, I need to be furloughed. But again, the requirement is still that it's at the organisation's request. So I think what they're trying to show is that in general, we don't expect public sectors to be furloughed, but of course there are going to be circumstances where they are. So you follow the same circumstance. If the role would be made redundant because of coronavirus, then furlough is the way I've interpreted the guidelines.
And somebody has asked, as they work for a charity that receives some government funding to operate their services, are they able to furlough? I assume it would be the same.
I think it's the same. I think, you know, some charities, what they're actually able to do is almost tie their employees back to where the funding comes from if they've got different service sectors. So if you are in the part of the charity that's got the public sector part of the funding, it's what I've just said. If you're in the part of the charity that isn't public sector, whether it's charitable donations or any other, you would follow kind of the commercial sector approach.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the guidance to specifically mention those organisations that are only part funded by government, and if any organisations might be expected to furlough, it's those. But as Tom said, the wider position is they choose their words carefully. They say they expect that the scheme won't be used by many public sector organisations. So there's clearly no prohibition on public sector organisations furloughing.
And the example that I came to where I think it could be allowed is, you know, if you've got a publicly funded leisure centre as an example. Now, leisure centres have been closed. So what are the options for that employer? Well, you could either keep them on full pay, because there's nothing to say that you can't just keep paying your employees. You come to an agreement to say you aren't going to work, but we'll pay you. But I think that would probably be a true example where you would be furloughed because the work isn't there because of coronavirus.
Got a question around car allowance. Some of our employees receive a car allowance, which is paid with salary and subject to deductions, but treated as a separate item. We do have a contractual right to remove car allowances based on not meeting a mileage level. How should car allowances be treated for furloughed employees? Should it continue or stop?
Let me separate them out if that's okay, because if you've got a contractual clause that says you don't have to pay it based on a set of circumstances, that changes it. If it's just a standard car allowance, if that is what you would consider an obligatory payment, so the select committee broadened again yesterday what considers salary that you have to look at, and it's anything that is obligatory. Now, a normal car allowance clause is an obligatory payment, so it's just you will get this amount of money per pay period. So I would include that. If you've got a clause that then starts talking about if you don't meet a certain amount of miles, then we won't pay your car allowance. Well, you've got a clause that says that, so you wouldn't include it because they're not doing the miles for you to actually be able to activate that clause. So all you're doing is following the clause as it's written in your contract.
I'd want to look at that that clause fairly carefully just to ensure that the current circumstances are within its contemplation and covered by it. You know, are you genuinely allowed to reduce in these circumstances? Is it broadly enough drafted to allow that? But you know, if it is, then you simply stop paying it and you don't reclaim it. But if it isn't, then it's a contractual payment and it's potentially reclaimable under this scheme like any other contractual payment would be.
I'd also just add, because I absolutely agree, I'd add, is it within the spirit of doing it as well? So actually, if you look at the financials that are sat behind it, what if you choose not to pay it when it might be a bit grey, what's that going to do to your employee engagement? You know, your employee's going to just get annoyed, and it actually saving 50 quid a month, for argument's sake. I know that the payments are higher and I'm not trying to be facetious, but saving that amount of money, is that the right trade-off to make to possibly annoy your workforce when we're all operating under such extreme circumstances at the moment? That's going to be a question for you as the employer.
Yeah, and there will be a time after this, and people will remember how organisations treated them within this. And I think that goes back to Tom's point about clarity. that if you can open it up so everyone understands why you made the decisions that you did and the context that you're operating in and how hard you were trying to keep going, that's one thing. And I think people will accept actually quite a bit of change and support the organisation going through that. If you see this as an opportunity to cut corners, treat people badly because you feel that there's a kind of opportunity to do that, they'll remember that as well in a very different way. So it's a chance to bring people together where possible, but it's also a chance for people to think, as soon as this is over, I need to go and find somewhere else to be.
Some questions around any advice you can give to help people out that fall between the gaps. So people that started with you after 28th of February, what kind of options are there?
Yes, it is a challenge. I mean, the government, the select committee yesterday, every single MP asked Jim Harrod this question: why can't you include new starters? And they were very clear, and he was pointing people to, unfortunately, it would probably, from a benefit and a government perspective, it's universal credit. Now, again, as the employer, you don't have to do that. You can, if you've got the ability and the funding and you really want to keep this person, try and come up with some creative way, if possible, of getting them some money. At the end of the day, most employers have spent a long time trying to recruit talent. We, for years, have been talking about a war for talent. You've got two sides to the equation. If financially you genuinely can't do it, that's one question, that's one conversation to have with this employee. The other is actually, as an employer, we can afford it. Then do something I would argue, do something for that employee, because you've spent God knows how long trying to recruit them in the first place. Do you really want to lose them over what financially you can afford to absorb in your organisation?
Yeah, and we talked earlier about selecting for furlough. Maybe one of the things you look at, your volunteers, if you're going to ask for volunteers, are likely to come from that group that know they qualify under the scheme. Maybe prioritise for your core team more recent starters. There's a risk of that being indirectly discriminatory on grounds of age. But in the circumstances, probably you'd be able to make out a justification argument, i.e. keeping your team together through this crisis. One of the great benefits of the furlough scheme is that it helps to keep your team together. If it doesn't apply to new starters, you need to find a different way of doing that. And that may be, if you need to keep a core team, keeping them as part of that core team.
Somebody's just asked for a bit of clarity. I know we covered holidays earlier. Are we able to furlough employees at 80% for 4 days a week and agree with them they could use their annual leave 1 day a week to top up to 100% salary?
I think with agreement that's fine in principle. Yeah.
Yeah, again, I think with agreement, yes. I would ask why. It sounds like you're starting to get into quite complicated arrangements when all people want is simplicity. So if there's another way that you could do it to make it simple, so for example, another way to look at the same situation is you're going to spend 3 weeks on furlough, or 4 weeks on furlough, then the 5th week is annual leave. People tend to understand those things a bit better. If you're starting to come up with, on the 3rd day of the 3rd month, you'll get your full pay, people will look at you and go, I don't understand what you're talking about. Make it as simple as possible.
I guess one of the concerns that might be trying to address would be people coming back after this crisis with a huge chunk of annual leave still to take. But of course, we've now got the comfort of being able to defer at least 4 weeks annual leave across subsequent 2 years. So that helps to allay that concern to a degree.
And I agree. I think more the point that I was trying to make is, don't do 1 day here, 1 day there, because it gets confusing for people. Absolutely, if people want to use leave because they want to top up pay, or the company wants to enforce because they don't want a bulk of annual leave coming back, that's fine under what we've talked about earlier. But in terms of communicating it, make it as easy for people to understand as possible.
What can you do if somebody is refusing to be furloughed?
The advice I've been given to clients is, well, you just need to set out the options that are available to the individual. So they can either be furloughed, and again, as Andrew's pointed out, this is a contractual change, but ultimately they can either be furloughed, or it's unpaid leave, or it's redundancy, are pretty much the options that we can see. Or if you have a layoff clause, it becomes a technical layoff rather than furlough. Again, I think it's about engaging with your workforce to go, well, these are the options. And to be honest with you, furlough is the best of all of these options. Which one would you like? But yeah, I'm not sure if Andrew's got anything else to add.
Well, because there may be people in the workforce for whom redundancy is a better option if they've got long service, if they're getting close to what we used to call a retirement age. That might be the option for them. They don't have to agree to be furloughed. Mm-hmm. The only option, if they're not furloughed, is really redundancy, realistically. But that may work for them, and that may be the route to go down in that particular situation.
Mm-hmm. And something around unfurloughing, how much notice do you have to give for unfurloughing? And somebody's asked, if you're furloughed for 4 weeks, could you be called back for work during that time and unfurloughed? So how does that process work?
So there's no guidance at all in terms of notice that you have to give to unfurlough someone to bring them back. Technically, while you're on furlough, you are supposed to be available for work, quote unquote. So in theory, you get to 4:50 if your working day is 9 to 5. You get to 4:50 on a Thursday. Your employer could phone you and go right back in at 9 o'clock tomorrow. So that's that part. The second part, can you unfurlough? You can. Now, there is a minimum furlough period of 3 weeks. And if you divorce kind of what you're doing with your employees versus what you're doing as the employer to get the grant, it's a minimum 3 weeks for you to be able to get the grant, which I would then argue keep your employees on furlough for 3 weeks. If you're going to try and call them back after they've been on furlough for 2 weeks and then you're going to call them back, you just won't be able to claim the grant. It is actually that clear cut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm being told that we've hit time, so all we've got time for this afternoon, and I do realise this is a complex topic and it's really changing all the time, so I hope that the session did provide some clarity. I know we didn't answer all your questions, but we had 468 and we also got about 60 yesterday, so I can't do the maths, but it's a lot of questions. So I'm sorry if we didn't get to all of them. Do remember, if you're a CIPD member, you can use the HR Inform helpline. Those are that can be dealt with on an individual basis. Also, we will be updating Coronavirus Hub the whole time. And a reminder that this webinar is going to be available on demand, and to look out for future webinars on coronavirus related topics. I hope you all managed to get some form of rest this Easter weekend, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.